So today we're going to be talking about global crisis. And I was saying that this, I think, is a really interesting topic because I think the world is in some kind of a crisis. And the big question is, what does this do to the risk of political violence and terrorism, kidnap and ransom, and other crises? So today we're going to be hearing from one of our partners, Unity Advisory Group, Allum, and Catia is going to introduce him now. And we're also going to hear briefly from Catia Folgore, who is iTOO's very own expert in crisis management and crisis insurance. And we have a range of crisis insurance products. So I think it's going to be a really interesting talk and one that I'm really interested to listen to. We also on the call have Peter Tilbrook, who's going to be listening in. And Peter Tilbrook is from TMHCC, and he's our reinsurance partner to iTOO. And we partner with HCC, and Peter's based in Barcelona, actually. So Peter, great to have you joining us. So I think let's get straight into it because I'm sure you're all eager to listen to what Paul has to say. And I'm going to first hand over to Catia, our own expert, and Katia's going to do an introduction, and then Paul, over to you. So Catia, if you're there, great to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our session this morning. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Catia Folgore. I'm part of the iTOO team, looking after the crisis management products, as Justin mentioned. Today we'll be looking at Kidnap and Ransom. And together with our partners, Tokyo Marine, we make use of a response company and consultants to assist our clients with pre and post incidents. We use Unity Advisory Group and On-Call International. Unity is privately owned and wholly independent and has specific, relevant and continuous expertise which assist our clients. And these go back to the early 1990s. The management team are recognized leaders in this discrete area of the security landscape. And today we have the absolute pleasure of introducing Paul Allum to you. Paul is the Director of Global Risks within the Unity Group and has 16 years private sector experience supporting commercial, government and military clients. Paul specializes in security intelligence and liaison, and has knowledge of protective security and operational risk. He's a former Royal Marines commander and lives in the UK. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Paul and hope that you enjoy the presentation this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Catia. Good afternoon, everyone. And for those that attended the presentation with iTOO and Tokyo Marine HCC, I think just for lockdown, then welcome back and thank you for attending. For those that are new to Unity, then I hope you find this presentation both insightful and useful. What we're going to do here is we're going to provide an initial policyholder briefing. So as a new client or perhaps a renewal, what we try and achieve is an initial call with the policyholder, and my job there is really to understand their risk profile. I want to know, where their vulnerabilities and operational risks lie, and that's usually done over email prior to having this call. And then from that, I can produce some interesting slides and for a discussion about perhaps how we might be able to provide preventative training and other types of services in order to de-risk their operations. And the rest of the conversation we have is based around what we're going to go through now, this initial policyholder call where we look at things like, the response mechanism, how you do that, and the type of services we offer around incident management. So, as Catia said, we're privately owned and wholly independent. We have a clear focus on pre-instant and post-instant advisory services in the field of coercive crimes, such as kidnap, extortion, illegal detention, threat and intimidation cases, and the search for missing persons. Our role is essentially to assist the client in resolving that matter, and that has to be conducive, if you like, to ensuring the safety and security of their continuing operations, their reputation, and their assets. We act within the law, and we have a solid understanding of public policy issues, which is important when you consider many of the countries in which kidnappings take place have a no ransom policy, or perhaps the organization has within its crisis management manual has a policy for not paying ransom. So there's a lot of consideration that goes into that part of assisting the client if indeed there was a kidnap for ransom event. And our aim essentially is to secure the safe and timely release of the hostage and the removal of a threat. So the safe and timely release of a hostage if it's a kidnapping situation, and the removal of a threat if it's an extortion event or threat or intimidation case. So as Catia said, we've been doing this since the early 1990s. We've responded to 1,500 cases in over 80 countries. And many of those are repeat cases in high-risk countries. And as you'll see from one of the upcoming slides, kidnappings continue to occur in, I would say, sort of in insecure places, perhaps 10 to 15 countries in the world, where we see persistent kidnap risk. The team, we've opted for a professionally diversified and geographically dispersed team instead of having all of our consultants in one place. There's some advantages to that, the main one being speed of response. And so where, for example, in recent cases, there's been an incident in a country in sub-Saharan Africa, well, we'll have a consultant either in that country or in a neighboring country. And so the speed of response is very important. What that also does is it provides us with a strengthened network of contacts and sources, both government, local level security forces, law enforcement agencies. It means that the consultants usually speak the language, so have some proficiency, whether it be French or there's a number of languages that our consultants speak, but all the sort of main languages around the world are spoken by our team. And of course, they understand the security situation, which is really important, because one of the things that happens after the initial response to a kidnap case is intelligence gathering. You have to know who you're dealing with. And so the consultant, along with his or her network, helps us to understand the nature of the threat. Who are these kidnappers? What is their capability and intent? What is their motivation? And as Catia said, the management team, I'm the junior. I've only been in the industry for about 16 years, but we'll just talk briefly about Simon, who's the principal of the company. Some of you may have heard or know him. He has a background in the police, in the Met Police, and led control risk kidnap desk for just under a decade. He's worked pretty much in every role from operations all the way up to strategic leadership in this field. Charles, or Chuck Regini, he's a former FBI lead negotiator. He helped develop the foreign hostage program for the US government. And again, he's been doing this for 20 plus years. So both of them highly experienced, and then the junior here with just a few years less. But I spent most of my time less at corporate level and more working within the incident management role for oil companies, the US government, NGOs, and other commercials mostly around Africa and the Middle East, until my wife said it's too dangerous, we've just had a kid and you need to go into a corporate role. So here I am now, sat behind a desk. Dedicated research and intelligence. So as a policyholder, you have access to an intelligence platform that gives you or provides trip advisories, security analysis, alerts on covering 180 countries, more than 300 cities. You also have access to a daily intelligence brief, which is sent to you by email Monday to Friday. And that kind of looks at the key security issues of that day. So you have access to that. And then we are partnered, we have a strategic partnership with a company called On Call International, who are a travel security management company that their main work is in around medical evacuations, but they also deal with crisis events and security related evacuations. So that is where we have assistance when we're dealing with political evacuations. And On Call International, they are responsible for the crisis response center that you will call into as a policyholder for when you experience an emergency situation. And they also, that line is also there for non-time critical things, like, for example, if you are traveling to an unfamiliar country, or you are concerned because there has been an increase in incidents in a country, or there's been a deterioration of security, then we always encourage the policyholder to call the crisis response line and ask to speak to a security analyst. And one of the regional analysts will get back to you and talk you through the security situation. So if you don't find the information that you're looking for on the security platform, then we encourage you to call the hotline and ask the question. It's not just there for when you're dealing with a crisis. And we would encourage policyholders to call that number anyway and practice, have a practice with the response operator when sort of simulating an incident. The other consultants we have supporting the 14 primary consultants who are sort of globally dispersed are people like forensic profilers, psychologists, PTSD counselors, who will use in the case of, for example, last year we had a threat case in Central Asia, and there was a letter that was sent to the victim's family, and we were unsure really of the intent, and so we brought in one of our forensics profilers to look at this letter. They also spoke the language and to determine the seriousness and credibility. Hi, I don't know who's just joined the call, but for anyone just joining the call, please ensure that your mic is muted until perhaps after the presentation, but nice to see you on the call. And then we have first responders, who are just additional contacts we use within our network in the event of a crisis. So as I said, our role essentially is the safe and timely release of the hostage, the removal of threat, and the safeguarding of people and assets. And we do that all within the law or in line with the corporate and family policy. Our job is to advise and support you through to the successful resolution of the case. You are the decision maker as the policyholder, and our job is essentially to stand next to you and advise you through each and every decision made on that case. So here I've included a slide about the global risk environment, because I thought it could be quite beneficial given how things have sort of changed over the last year, or especially in the last 6 months with the COVID crisis. But there's a couple of key trends that I've certainly seen over the last year, or at least the last few years. And the first one is really an evolution of kidnapping that, was very prominent in the Americas and now has moved into Africa. And that sort of shift is because of, just give me one moment, so I just need to close my windows. The UK is experiencing a heat wave at the minute, so I'm just gonna be stifled in here without the windows open, but at least you don't have the background noise of someone drilling. So you've seen this evolution, and the reason being is because there's been a growth of insecurity in Africa, in parts of Africa. There's been, internal conflict between borders. We've seen a growth of organizations like militant groups, Islamist groups, leftist guerrilla fighters in parts of Cameroon that have essentially developed in insecure parts of the country. There's this whole area of ungoverned space and porous borders, which has allowed these groups to move from one place to the next unchallenged. And so we've seen an increase in kidnapping. Now, another trend is that we've seen fewer foreigners kidnapped. So in 2015 and 16, there were hundreds of foreign employees, foreign travelers, business people being targeted by groups. And we've seen a huge reduction. Most of those were being targeted by these groups in insecure parts of the affected countries. And what's happened is we've seen a change in how organizations look at their duty of care obligation. And then we've seen local and international military operations erode territory, and by doing so has squeezed these groups and reduced their ability to target the sort of fringes of main cities, as well as rural areas where many victims are targeted. And if you look at the pie on the bottom left corner, if that was a pie chart, if that was a graphic from 5 years ago, then you would see probably more extractives targeted, far more NGOs, and instead what we've seen now is business people and dependents targeted. They're mostly local, regional victims, not necessarily foreign or international. And we've seen, an increase in teachers targeted, but most of that pie is comprised of incidents in Nigeria. So looking at the map and looking at Nigeria, you can see it's sort of a purple. And that is the kidnap risk hotspot globally. Has been for many years, with India just behind. And the difference being between the two countries, if you like, as well as Mexico, if you take those as the top three, is that in Mexico, it's organized crime groups targeting locals, lots of intimidation attacks. In India, it's lots of local targeting of business people, dependents, business disputes, things like that going wrong, and so they're kidnapped. But Nigeria, the prevalence of kidnapping in Nigeria, targeting anyone by groups that are not necessarily professional or organized, which is more of a concern if you're kidnapped, because you really don't want to be kidnapped by an inexperienced group who don't understand hostage negotiation, they don't understand the processes, and they don't understand the theater, if you like, that goes into a hostage negotiation, because it's a lot about theater when you're dealing with kidnappers and how you interpret and deal with their threats. And so there's a lot of unprofessional groups operating in Nigeria that are just targeting anyone. And so there's been an increase in kidnappings there against foreigners as well as locals. But those foreigners that are targeted are mostly Chinese because of the construction work that's going on and supported by Chinese development in Nigeria. And so what we're seeing now is this change from what were long duration kidnappings, where a victim would be held for weeks, months, taken into the jungle where they controlled territory and weren't worried about being caught by the police, to short duration kidnappings that last a day, 2 days, 3 at most. I mean, the average captivity now is under 5 days globally, and the average ransom payment is much lower than it used to be. Indeed, so is the average ransom demand. So demands 5 years ago were in the millions. If it was a criminal group, it may have been in the hundreds of thousands. And payments were, a percentage of that, not always 10%. It would depend on the market value of the area in which the victim was taken, because there is a market value for most victims when you have a financially motivated kidnapping group. But now in today's sort of kidnap risk environment, what we see is a reduction, if you like, in ransom demands and payments. So demands are usually less than $100,000 US dollars, and payments are significantly less. And depending on the country, of course, it's always specific to a country. But generally speaking, for my team, most payments are under $5,000 to $10,000 US dollars. There are very few payments now that you see in the sort of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of US dollars. other than, of course, the exception being if an individual is targeted by a militant group. And a good example of that would be Silvia Romano, the Italian NGO, who was targeted on the border between Kenya and Somalia, I think November 2018, if my memory serves me well. And she was held for just over a year, and through negotiation involving the Italian and Turkish intelligence agencies, a reported ransom of 4 million euros was paid for her release to the Al-Shabaab militant group. So Islamist groups are still being paid an awful amount of money, a lot of money, but criminals are, you know, the cases we've worked on in the last year or so, criminals are paid, you know, much less. So there's been an evolution in all things kidnapping. So we've got an intelligence picture now of what kidnapping looks like, and so you can imagine the perpetrator. You can imagining we're profiling a group, and that's really what happens in the initial response. But let's go through it. So you, as the client, have experienced what you believe is a kidnap incident. So as the policyholder, you will call the crisis hotline. And be connected to a security specialist, you know, who's going to take details on, you know, who was taken, what happened, when did it take place, where did it happen, and most importantly, why did it happen? And that last point is really about trying to understand motive. The response hotline specialist is going to take all of your information, and then they are going to call us immediately afterwards, and we will then call you back as the client, and that is usually done within a minute or two. It's very quick, very fast, and then we offer you advice and support, and I'll talk a little bit about those services in the coming slide, but that's essentially how things begin, and it's a virtual environment then. So, you know, we are providing that advice and support, trying to understand whether it's a missing person case or if indeed it has been a kidnapping. And once we ascertain whether or not it is a kidnapping, and let's say it is, then we will, if applicable, deploy a consultant to the client's incident management team, the country level where the victim has been taken. Now, let's say, for example, the victim was taken in Yemen, or a hostile environment that's simply too dangerous to send a consultant. Then, because of duty of care obligation, and probably for the client as well, the incident management team might be positioned outside of the country in a neighboring country. But either way, that consultant will be deployed immediately, and, you know, aim to arrive to assist at the operational level within sort of, you know, 48 hours, depending on where they're traveling from. And there are things that obviously we have to consider there around visas and the like, but our consultants based regionally maintain visas for most high-risk countries where we expect kidnappings to take place, which is an important point to note. And then we deploy a consultant to the corporate team, to the crisis management team at the corporate level. And their job there is to advise strategic leadership with all of the executive decisions made during the case. Then the unity management team, i.e. Simon, Chuck or myself, will manage the case. Now, we work off historical data. So we have 14 primary consultants, then 3 managers. And what we found is we could comfortably handle more than 15, 16 cases at any one time, but that's just never the way it is. There are never that many cases, kidnappings going on at one time. So we have ample redundancy and bandwidth for dealing with a number of kidnappings at any one time. But we are there essentially as the management team to provide assistance if required to the consultants in developing the negotiation strategy or dealing at the corporate level, and we're advising throughout the case. And it just might be that the kidnappers' demands change. You know, they started with some sort of ideological or political reason for kidnapping the victim, and then they shift to a financial demand. And so our job then, with our case experience, is to continuously monitor the situation and provide advice around whether or not we need to change or move around the negotiation strategy with the perpetrators. And of course, once the victim has been released, we then look to provide an operational debrief. And we want involvement in that purely because of our case experience. The victim will feel more comfortable at that stage dealing with someone that has an understanding of how these things work. And so we would often ask to be involved in any operational debrief. And of course, if they have suffered a physically or mentally degrading captivity, then it might be that, you know, the client requires, or we would advise and assist, because we have PTSD counsellors, support in stress management. So that's the sequence of events for responding to a kidnapping. And I'll give you a sort of a case study, if you like. We had a situation in the DRC. The client contacted the Unity hotline to report an attack on their mine site, resulting in the abduction of multiple employees, both local workers as well as regional expats. Again, we deployed 2 consultants, one to the IMT in country, the incident management team, and the other one to the corporate headquarters. That then increased to 2 more consultants at the country level because it was quite a difficult and convoluted case. So, you know, it's not always just that one consultant will deploy. We'll deploy as many as required in order to assist effectively with the case. The hostages were taken by a local armed group who had carried out similar kidnappings against foreign organizations, companies operating in that part of the DRC. They had demanded money initially, and that led also to other concessions, like you know, community outreach development around digging water wells and schools and things of that nature. And this group were professional. They were heavily armed. They had local support, and they didn't necessarily control territory, but they were so deep into the jungle that the security forces, you know, didn't have any intelligence on the area, you know, weren't capable of finding them, and so, you know, they were hidden well and not concerned with being caught. And of course, that prolonged the kidnapping because they were safe essentially holding the victim. So the Unity team at the ground, at the field level, provided assistance to the IMT to put in place a negotiation strategy. And after a negotiated settlement, the employees were released unharmed, all safe and unharmed. And then upon release, we offered that debrief. You know, let's have an operational debrief, and for those that need it, some emotional support and perhaps counselling. So what is the advice we offer? Excuse me. Initially, it's about advising on the crisis management structure. There are organisations that are prepared and organisations that aren't. And that's not being critical of organisations that aren't. It might be that they've just never experienced a crisis. But if they haven't, if that's the type we're dealing with, then we're assisting them with, you know, setting up that crisis management structure at corporate level. What are the roles and responsibilities of key individuals in dealing with that case? You know, we're looking at the process of communication. You know, who needs to be informed and to what level. You know, and of course, confidentiality is key. So internal processes around communication are developed, as well as, you know, the internal and external reporting of the incident to ensure that, you know, there aren't lots of people knowing about it that could be leaked out to the media, or worse still, leaked out to the kidnappers. And then we're developing a negotiation strategy based on that intelligence. You know, what is the market value of victims in that area? Do we know? Because once we know, we can start to develop a strategy around how much, if it is, of course, a financially motivated kidnapping, how much we think that they're looking to receive in terms of a ransom, if indeed if indeed it is a ransom that we're going to seek. And it might not be. It might be that the company say, no, we're not paying ransoms, and the government are going to come down on us heavy, so there's no way. And so what we do then is try and seek alternative concessions. I can talk about an example of that after this if we've got time. Communicating with the hostage takers. So we don't want the hostage takers talking to everyone, the family, the authorities. We want them to talk to one person, which is our communicator. So, we assist the client with selecting and training a communicator to deal with the hostage takers. And that is a quite a unique situation for a local employee. So it takes a lot of support and mentoring in that case. And at the incident management level, you would have someone there, the consultant, providing that support. As I said earlier, we're continuously looking at the situation to see if there's anything changing within the kidnapper's motivational intent. We're providing incident management recommendations around dealing with the authorities, dealing with the victim's family, the media, and then of course, when they are released, it's again looking at that rehabilitation and how we assist the client with getting that individual back to work. And what we've done in previous cases is have one of our PTSD counsellors on call for the client should they need to call and ask for advice about the victim months later down the line, if they don't feel like with HR that they're recovering properly, and perhaps want to be moved into a different role or have concerns about post-traumatic stress, then we're there on call to assist with that. So this is the last slide, and I think that sort of takes us to, well, I'm a bit early, but what we're looking at here is our preventative service. So at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about when we have an initial call, we'll talk through the client's risks, and then we will talk about how we can assist with reducing that risk. And so Tokyo Marine HCC provide a subsidized amount, a prevention allowance, of which many of you will be familiar with, which can go towards any type of training here. And one of the most popular courses we run is a tabletop crisis management exercise, where we take the policyholder through a sort of a familiarization of a kidnap incident in a hostile country, and how they structure themselves, how they respond to incident management processes, and then the post debrief considerations, and then we have a simulation and exercise at the end of it, and not to put them under pressure, but to see if they've taken on board what has been taught, learnt, and to see how they react, coming up with different ways of problem solving, a variety of different tasks based around the considerations during a kidnap incident. We've also found over the last few months, sort of not post-COVID, but as government restrictions ease across parts of the developing world, we've seen many clients, policyholders come to us and say, well, we can see that the situation may turn bad because there's rising inflation and unemployment, there's no economic package in these countries, and so we're concerned that our assets, our people might be targeted with a rise of crime, and so we will work with them to develop their crisis management plans. It might be that they operate, and we had a client just last month that's operating in quite a hostile environment, is really concerned, and so we spent some time looking at their evacuation plans and improving those for when and if something takes place. But there is a concern across many of Tokyo Marine HCC's clients that operate in the developing world that things are going to get worse because of rising, unemployment and inflation, and the concern around, social unrest and criminality. So that is something that we've spent quite some time on over the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks, helping clients develop that. And prior to that, one of the things we were doing was providing evacuation support. Now, I didn't mention that in the brief. We talked about how to deal with a kidnap incident, but it would be the same process. If you were a policyholder and you were in a country that was experiencing unrest and you wanted to discuss evacuation options, then you would call the hotline, and you would be, we punched through to us, and we would spend some time taking you through the options available for an an evacuation. It might not be that you need to evacuate, and we would always say, based on sort of an intellectual rigor of the situation, whether or not you actually need to evacuate. Maybe it's that you hibernate, you shelter in place, or maybe it's that you relocate in the country. And so we would provide advice and support around an evacuation through that same hotline number. And if indeed it was the client's decision to evacuate, then we would support that. And you as the client would have a conversation with Tokyo Marine HCC to understand or determine whether or not that evacuation is covered under one of the triggers. And I won't go too much into that, because if there's a question around that, then perhaps I'll leave that for Peter Tilbrook from Tokyo Marine HCC to talk about. But those sorts of things are covered as well. And last but not least, we do a lot of travel security training, and there's two types really. One is almost a brief like this, where we provide sort of an overview of the key risks in a country, and then we talk about how you mitigate those risks traveling from landing at the international or regional airport, and how to recognize, be situationally aware, practice good situational awareness, so that you de-risk yourself as you move from the airport to the hotel to the office. So the travel security training is quite useful. The other type is hostile environment awareness training, which is more physical, based around things like conduct after capture, medical training, things like that. So that's also a service we provide around risk prevention. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I hope that was okay for everyone, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you so much for the talk, and we always judge a good talk by the number of people that stay on the line, and it's actually increased. So we've had about 355 people listening, and also the number of questions. So it would be great if you don't mind, Paul, if I can go through some of the questions. And we often find that the best learnings and interactions take place during these questions. So Paul, I had one question, just quickly, a quick one. You spoke about in your slide on kidnapping trends, 1,351 kidnap incidents in 76 countries. Is that just handled by Unity Advisory, or is that sort of the global stats?
So these are cases that our security team monitor or have collected through their contacts and social media. These aren't cases that Unity work on. Okay. Unity has responded to, I think on average, we probably respond to about 40 cases a year.
Great.
And even then, that statistic is based on our information. So globally, there is a figure of 30 to 40,000 kidnappings taking place, and the reason they're not all reported is because the media aren't reporting. Sadly, if it is a kidnap risk country with a high rate of incidents, then the media aren't interested in reporting on it. So of course you don't know they're happening. And the other reason why you see underreporting is because the victim is scared of reprisal attack from the kidnappers. And so they, through fear of being targeted again, they keep their mouth shut and don't report it to the authorities. Maybe the authorities are involved, and so they certainly won't go to them. And so there is a great deal of underreporting when it comes to kidnap incidents. And I would say 1,300 incidents from the last 12 months is really the tip of the iceberg.
Thanks very much. Paul, another question that I found really interesting was you mentioned that it's a much better risk if you are kidnapped by professional kidnappers because they understand hostage negotiations. Do you have any stats or thoughts on if someone is kidnapped and they have an insurance policy and professional crisis response, or if they're just on their own? Do you have any stats on or thoughts on kidnapping trends with or without a professional consultant?
No, but I'd say if you are kidnapped, they're really the two things you want to have is kidnap risk insurance to pay it, and a crisis response team that can help you negotiate the ransom. Because remember, what we're trying to do here is not pay money. We're trying to show the kidnappers that there is no money left. You're trying to show them that Mr. Kidnapper, you have expended our financial resources, so don't ever come back. Because a lot of the organizations that are targeted, they want to continue operating in that country. And so if one of their employees is kidnapped and it is a bad negotiation, and the organization, because of a concern for reputational damage, decide that they're just going to pay the kidnappers, then what does that do? First of all, from a public policy point of view, okay, it's bad for the company, because it says, well, we're prepared to pay a ransom, and that could put that could have a negative impact with the authorities. And of course, for you as a company, you then may be targeted again because, well, you're the company that are paying the ransoms without a negotiation. So the public policy issue is you're making the crime attractive, and from a an organizational perspective, you're going to be targeted again because you pay the ransom. So the job of negotiation is to bring it down to such an amount that they never come back. And so if you are a victim, you want to be taken by an established group, because like I said earlier, they understand how things work. They know how much that victim is worth. And so really, to be in good stead, if you have kidnap risk insurance or specialty risk insurance and a crisis response team, then you have a higher chance of getting that victim back alive and well.
Thank you so much, Paul. So we're going to go through a couple more questions. So I've got one from Dave Hopcroft, which I think is a really interesting one. And I know Catia is having some technical difficulties with Zoom. So if Catia, you're on the line, you're welcome to jump in. And if Peter Torbrook, our partner from HCC in Barcelona, is on the line, you're welcome to jump in. But let me do my best to answer Dave Hopcroft's question. Dave says, is the trigger a ransom demand, clearly a kidnapping where ransom, or clearly a kidnapping where ransom will follow? So Dave, my response to that is Kidnap and Ransom probably doesn't do a good job of marketing itself as a policy, because it covers a lot more than actual kidnap and ransom. So it probably, in most circles, it's actually called global crisis insurance. And a kidnap and ransom insurance policy actually covers around about 20 different policy triggers. So it would cover kidnapping, and it would cover a kidnapping, and the policy would be triggered before there's actually a ransom demand. But it also does cover incidents such as hijack, extortion, it covers stalking, express kidnapping for a very short time, and it even covers things like political and emergency evacuation and wrongful detention. So it covers about 20 different policy triggers. And also in terms of the policy cover, that the policy would provide cover for, obviously, and I think the most important is the actual crisis response. So the services of Unity Advisory, there's unlimited cover for their services in any one of these crisis responses. But obviously it also covers the actual payment of the ransom, which is a policy of indemnity. And that means that the actual insured must pay the premium or the ransom first, and then be reimbursed by the insurance policy. And it also covers other things like counseling, personal belongings that may be lost in an insured event. So it's actually a really broad and interesting cover. So I don't know if Peter Torbrook, if I've done a good enough job, you can keep quiet, but if you would like to add anything to that, it would be lovely to hear from you.
Hey Justin, morning everyone.
Hi, Peter.
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
Good. No, I think you summarized it really well. The interesting point I picked up on from one of Paul's comments was that ransom payments themselves are not that high as perhaps we have this image in the media, or we have this image of these events and millions of dollars being exchanged, and that's, as Paul said, simply not the case usually. But the key thing about our policy is all these additional expenses that it covers, and actually those are the things that end up costing more money. If you think about the scope of our additional expenses and salary costs and medical expenses and repatriation of people and all these things, then you have loss of earnings, you have legal liability consequences of the policy. And actually it's those events that end up being the highly indemnified amounts. Of course, the unlimited side of the Unity is a big expense too if you're paying that directly rather than with an insurance policy. So interesting point from Paul.
Thanks, Peter, and I'm sure there'll be some more questions from you. So Peter is from Tokyo Marine HCC, and he's our reinsurance partner. And it's been great working with Peter as we've launched this Kidnap and Ransom product. So we have Paul, and maybe Peter, you want to jump in as well. We have a really interesting question from Dale. So he says, do you have any intel regarding the recent kidnappings and terrorist activity in northern Mozambique? And obviously this is a big concern because of the gas reserves and the big foreign investment in the area. And obviously being in South Africa, or Southern Africa, iTOO, and most of our clients and brokers on this call, northern Mozambique is fairly close to home, and an area where many of South African businesses are probably getting involved in doing business.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an interesting security environment. Cabo Delgado province is certainly becoming riskier, and what you have there is a local Islamist group that has, as far as our regional analysts can determine, they are linked to regional Islamist groups like Al-Shabaab. But so we don't know to what extent they have resources, but we do know that they are becoming more active. And so even in the last few months, we've seen a couple of attacks against the energy infrastructure, or not infrastructure, sorry, the energy industry. There was an ambush, I think, just 2 or 3 weeks ago against the third-party contractor to Total Energy, and you'll have to forgive me, I can't recall the name of it, but 3 employees were abducted, 8 were killed in the attack. So they are expanding, but at a very gradual rate. It's what I would say, it's a low-intensity insurgency at the minute, and it's a campaign of intimidation and violence against locals, where a bit like the Islamic State in 2014 in Iraq and Syria, they're essentially trying to espouse, the virtues of puritanical Islam. They're trying to intimidate the local population into, controlling them, so they don't report their activities to the police. And they're doing that quite violently by killing and executing village chiefs, abducting anyone of importance. And so we've seen a security deterioration. But on the other side of that, we've also seen the Mozambican forces move into areas and try and take control back to reinforce security and protect the oil infrastructure, the oil industry up there. And so attacks aren't growing at a rapid rate. And that's really a good sign, if you like, that the government are paying a lot of attention to try and reduce their capability, their space to operate, because we haven't seen that increase. So I think what you're going to see in Cabo Delgado is probably a continuation, this persistent sort of low-level campaign of small arms fire attacks, ambushes, the odd kidnapping. But and for having worked for an oil company in Basra province in Iraq many years ago, a lot of what oil companies are doing now is ensuring that they have armored vehicles, that they're monitoring the movements they make, that they're tracked, and that they have a good intelligence picture through local assets as to what routes are prone to militant attack, what areas are safe to travel, and what protective measures are required in order to de-risk their operation against this insurgency. But it is localized at the minute, and I don't think that you're going to see much of an increase because of the government effort. I think that hopefully that answers it.
Thank you so much, Paul, and really great answer. And we've seen that I'm getting a lot of questions coming on. So we've got still about 10 minutes, so we're going to spend some time discussing and answering these questions. And And this is a great way to learn and to answer the questions that you've been thinking about following this presentation. So we have a question from Margaret Ellison, and she said that she's heard that there are private security companies in Nigeria that could be employed to looking after visiting business persons, and they use diversion tactics and duplicate vehicles to confuse potential kidnappers. So she said, is this true? And would Unity get involved to that level of detail of recommending these security companies? And we also have another question on Nigeria while you're on that. We've had a question from John Kirby, who said, are there any parts of Nigeria that are worse than others? So it's really about security companies and what would you advise and who to use, and any parts of Nigeria that are worse than others.
Yeah, so we wouldn't, I don't have, I don't really have an answer to the question about whether or not local security companies are good or bad when it comes to protecting traveling business people. But I have seen cases in the last year, they're not very common, where the police are, brought in to provide protection to traveling executives. And that hasn't always gone well. There was an attack just outside Port Harcourt early last year where a criminal group ambushed a convoy of vehicles with a police car at the front, killed the police officer, the two police officers, and kidnapped the business people. Now, there's two ways of looking at travel security when you're in a high-risk country. You go low profile or you go high profile. And, this is not Unity's view, but my own from having operated like that in many hostile countries. I would always choose the low profile route because you don't want to make yourself a target. So essentially being picked up in a low profile vehicle and with a security trained driver, these are things, by the way, that we are involved in and we offer services in through our partners in Nigeria, then you're less likely to be targeted because, of course, what we're seeing is criminal groups watching people from the side of the road. I mean, that's how brazen it is. They are on the side of the road watching the expressways where lots of commuters are moving around. And when they see a vehicle that looks high profile or maybe the individuals have a level of perceived affluence as they're going past, then they'll pull them over. And so you really don't want to be high profile. The only time you want to be in a high profile move is if you're in a situation like a rural area, let's say Algeria, around Aminas, where that attack occurred many, many years ago. And perhaps now, in order to get from the airport to the oil installation, you need high profile. You need to be able to defend yourself against an ambush. And so you'd have, armored vehicles, security guys with weapons trained to defend the convoy in the event of an incident. But in most cases, in urban areas, wherever you are, the best profile would be low profile. You're less likely to be targeted. And so just to answer, and the last part of that, as I think I mentioned, Unity have globally a network of contacts, a Rolodex of local security companies that we use for when or if the client requires a level of protection going from the airport to the hotel. The second question, sorry, Justin, I didn't actually get a chance to write it down. What was the second question?
It was just, are there any parts of Nigeria that are worse than others?
Yes, northeast Nigeria is by far the worst area of Nigeria. But it depends when you say worse. If you're talking about an insecure environment, then northeast Nigeria. But if you're talking about kidnapping, then sadly, there's such a prevalence of this crime in Nigeria that, as I just mentioned, you only have to be in the wrong place at the wrong time going down an expressway and you will be targeted by a criminal group. And that's how common it is. I mean, people are literally being picked up from the side of the road, held for a couple of days. And these groups aren't sophisticated. They don't have, they don't have infrastructure. They don't have the safe houses to hold the victims. They don't have, dozens of criminals involved in that kidnap operation. It's normally like half a dozen, 5 or 6. And they take them into the bush. They feed them some beans and rice. They demand a ransom of, $15,000. They threaten with, we'll chop the victim's fingers off if you don't pay quickly, and payments are being made. Now, the worst bit about all of this is that it's been propagated in the media. So you know, one thing we talked about in this presentation is that confidentiality is key. It's all about the need to know policy. And sadly, what you're seeing in Nigeria is either whether it's the authorities or the victim's family or someone, or there's been such loose communication around the incident that, you know, everyone knows about it and it's reported in the media. So you can actually see what's going on in cases if you look at local media around kidnappings. So-and-so was kidnapped yesterday. The kidnappers have demanded, you know, 15 million naira. The family are thinking of paying this, and then the family pay an amount within a couple of days. Now, what that's done is it's broadcast it across the criminal underworld that, you know, if you go for a kidnapping of a lecturer or of a person of perceived wealth, then you're going to get this amount. So go ahead and do it because everyone's paying. So that's what's making the crime worse. That coupled with the fact that whilst there are some good police units in Nigeria that are doing a great job against that type of crime, there are also some really bad ones, some really incompetent units that are either involved in the crime or turn a blind eye to it. So Nigeria is experiencing a worsening situation. But just to finish on the question, you do not want to be taken in northeast Nigeria. That's obviously where we saw some aid workers killed this year. It's just a very insecure environment where the Islamic State affiliate ISWAP are operating, and they are very active and they're very good at resisting this sort of trilateral operation by Chilean, Niger and Nigerian forces. So they are established and expanding. So yeah, Nigeria is not a good place, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I think you probably turned any businesses wanting to do business in Nigeria off for a while, which is probably good advice.
Well, Justin, that's a really good point. But a bit like when, again, I apologize for keep bringing it back to Iraq. I worked there for 6 years. But businesses were flourishing in Iraq. So you can operate in an austere environment as long as you put in place the right security plan, you have the right security measures, and ensuring that you are proactive about risk and you're not reacting. And so any company can operate in Nigeria as long as they understand the risks and how to mitigate them. And we provide that advice. So I provided advice to a client that's operating in a part of Nigeria, in a rural area, earlier this year, that had concerns with rising crime, and we simply assisted them with their risk management framework, their security risk analysis, to ensure that, you know, the measures put in place were reducing the risk to their operation, their people, their assets, and their reputation. So it is possible.
Thank you so much, and that's a really good answer. So be prepared and understand the risks. I think we'll try and fit in 2 more questions quickly because we're nearly out of time. But here's an interesting one, and of course we couldn't avoid COVID-19. So we have a question here that says, COVID-19, how is this going to impact K&R trends and risks, with security forces being focused on enforcing curfews, etc.? And we've certainly seen that in South Africa, with people under economic strain and probably more political instability during a time of lockdown and uncertainty. What are the trends that you see in Kidnap and Ransom when travel bans are lifted?
Yeah, and you've kind of answered the question, I guess, because it's specific to countries. If I was to talk about Mexico, then organized crime groups taking advantage, as they are in Argentina and Brazil, taking advantage of COVID by offering services that the government can't. And so they're trying to capitalize, exploit this situation. And that doesn't necessarily mean more kidnappings, but it's essentially, you know, the government aren't offering these services. We're going to make money that way. Parts of Africa, we haven't really seen a change in the number of kidnappings because they're high risk, as I mentioned. And then in countries like medium risk countries, you're not seeing kidnappings so much because of social restrictions. But you know, so what I think you'll see is criminal gangs that don't have resources won't survive, and organized crime obviously will survive, is involved in other activities other than kidnapping, and so have probably been diverting their interest to those activities until, you know, COVID restrictions are eased, and then they'll have a pool of victims to target. And that sounds very sensationalist. It won't be a sudden, you know, increase of kidnapping, but that, you know, organized criminals will understand that international or foreign operations have probably either reduced their capacity or suspended their operations in countries where there's been a lockdown. And so they are expecting those companies to start back up again. And that with that brings an available pool of targets. And so there might be an increased risk of kidnapping there. But I would imagine, because as I said, there's no economic package for parts of the developing world, that you're going to see rising crime because people need money. They need, they need to sustain living. And so they turn to crime.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to just take one more question, and then I'll maybe combine two together, and then we're going to call it a day because we're out of time. I would like to say to everyone, if you have had a question that we haven't answered, we will take it down and we will come back to you and make sure that we answer all of the questions. So thank you very much for all of the great questions. So we've got two questions here, Paul. One is, what percentage of kidnap and ransom victims are actually murdered or killed and don't make it? Do you have any idea on that? Mm-hmm. And that's probably more out of interest. But I think another interesting question is, if negotiations in kidnapping, negotiations for ransom fail, do you provide assistance in a forcible rescue? And what are your thoughts on a forcible rescue? I'm sure you've got some.
Yeah, they're both really good questions. First and foremost, in cases that Unity has been involved in, we have a 97% success rate, and the 3% where we aren't successful is usually that the victim has a pre-existing illness and dies in captivity because they haven't had the medical treatment or drugs that they need in order to remain healthy, or, and this answers the second question, they've had a local police unit try and rescue them. And rescue is the least advisable of all options when it comes to hostage negotiation, because what we don't have in most cases is a rescue force that is trained to a high standard. Even the best special forces units in the world will tell you that they don't have a 100% success rate because there are too many unknowns. There's too much risk involved. Take, for example, the case in Benue last year where the 2 French tourists were held by a local Islamist group on the border with, I think it was Burkina Faso. And French special forces went in to rescue them. The intelligence was spotty, wasn't particularly good. And so, although they rescued them, one of the French special forces soldiers was killed in the incident. And so that's a really good example of where, if you don't have good intelligence, then you don't attempt to rescue. Now, if it's a local police unit that are pushing for a rescue, then our job is to advise the client in order to how you liaise, negotiate with the authorities to stop them from doing that, because that's going to put the victim's life at risk. So essentially, if a victim has a pre-existing illness, and they might perish in captivity because they're not treated, if they were injured in the abduction and perish because they weren't treated, or if there's a rescue attempt and they're killed by friendly fire, crossfire, the kidnappers kill them because they don't want them to be rescued, because of course that looks bad for their reputation. And so these are all reasons why we see victims killed. But I'm glad to say that is very uncommon. In nearly all of the cases, as I said, 97% of the cases we've dealt with, the victim is released unharmed. And it's very few cases where you see violence, and that is because the victim is a commodity. And if it's a financially motivated kidnapping, then, they want their money for the victim, so they're not going to harm them. And that's part of your negotiation strategy. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully that answered both questions, and hand it back over to Justin.
Thank you very much. And Paul, we're gonna call it a day now. So thank you so much for your time. And I think more than your time today, as iTOO, we really appreciate having an expert like Unity Advisory Group as our sort of crisis consultant. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to continuing to build our relationship further with you, and most importantly, our offering to our clients. Thank you also to Peter Tombrook from HCC Tokyo Marine, and thank you to all of our brokers that have joined us. As is tradition, if you want to put on your microphones and shout out and say cheers as you're leaving, that would be fantastic. And we will answer all of the questions that have come into to the message group. So I'm going to ask Tove just to save all of the questions, and we will come back to you with responses to the ones that we didn't answer today. Thank you so much. This has been a really